Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
Like, if I had my own private property, could I bury my loved one there?
Is this property going to be in your family's possession for longer than the next 20 years?
Well, aquamation also is called flameless, could be called flameless cremation. It is when you use water and then they add an alkali to it, and it speeds up the decomposition process.
Green burial, otherwise known as natural burial to some, is burial in a biodegradable container, such as maybe a linen or silk shroud, a simple pine box, or maybe a wicker casket, something of that nature. The body is unembalmed, and the goal is for the individual to return to the earth as expeditiously as possible.
I'm Sarah Fenton. How we choose to honor our deceased loved ones is greatly affected by culture, past experiences, and even the current state of the country, like we saw during the pandemic. Traditional burial methods, which includes a coffin with a loved one dressed in a formal wear, are still popular with families, but today there are more options that go beyond cremation and embalming. Here with us in the studio to talk about so-called alternative burial methods is Bellefontaine Funeral Director Gracie Griffin. Gracie, thank you for coming.
Thanks for inviting me.
And also joining us is Timothy Johnson, who owns Foundation Cremation in Des Peres. Timothy, also, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So, Timothy, let's start with you. Most people consider two options for their loved ones after they die: cremation or traditional embalming or burial. What's the breakdown of what people are choosing today, and how has it been changing?
Well, as you stated, there's normally a traditional burial that includes a casket, and then you also have the option of cremation. What I've seen trending lately, if you look at, I think a most recent study I've seen from Missouri Department of Health, in the state of Missouri, we average about 60,000 deaths a year. Just shy of 50% of those are cremations. Mm-hmm. By 2030, those projections are supposed to be around 60%. So cremations are on the upward trend.
Mm-hmm. And also, Gracie, people are discovering other options besides those two. I've heard about alternative burials called green burials. What do they mean when they talk about an alternative burial?
Well, sure. So green burial, otherwise known as natural burial to some, is burial in a biodegradable container, such as maybe a linen or silk shroud, a simple pine box, or maybe a wicker casket, something of that nature. The body is unembalmed, and the goal is for the individual to return to the earth as expeditiously as possible. So there's no vault involved in the process, and it's relatively non-invasive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I've also heard about something called aquamation. Timothy, I think you might have heard about that. Is that correct?
Yes, I have.
Tell us what aquamation is.
Well, aquamation also is called flameless, could be called flameless cremation. It is when you use water and then they add an alkali to it, and it speeds up the decomposition process, and it takes probably about 10 to 12 hours, and it kind of mimics the natural decomposition process, and it's not a more cost-effective, but it's a more environmentally friendly method of decomposition.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing with these alternative methods is it sounds like it's a little bit more hands-off. Both of you use the term natural. So what's the attraction there? And Gracie, let's start with you. When we're looking at these alternatives, what's the attraction to these sort of more natural, less invasive, or I don't know if I want to say invasive, but let's just say alternative. What's the attraction for families there?
Well, so I think that people who, I think for a very long time, people didn't realize that there was a different way to be buried other than the traditional way. They're aware of cremation, which is very different from burial. But a lot of times folks don't like the idea of of being embalmed. They don't like the idea of having a vault necessarily. And I think that this kind of started with folks looking for something different from the traditional, and then learning about this process that is indeed more natural. But something that's unique to green burial specifically is that it really allows the family an opportunity to be involved and control the process in some ways that normally they wouldn't be able to do. The funeral director's role oftentimes is more to manage the process for them and give families a little bit more choice. And I think that's appealing to people. In these days of the internet, folks have had a greater opportunity to be able to go out and seek information on their own. They're not relying on funeral professionals necessarily anymore. And I think that, Tim, I hope you might agree that that might be part of the reason for the upward trend in cremation as well as in green burial.
Yes, I agree.
Right. It sounds like there's a lot of changes going on in how people think about death and burial and funerals. And Tim, can you talk a little bit about that? Like, we're seeing such, like you said, a change in how people feel about cremation, how attractive it is to people. What do you think is behind that trend?
I think the more access to information, the more information you have, like Gracie said, then you can make an informed decision on the options that you have available. I think personally for me, COVID changed a lot of people's negative connotations toward cremation. Unfortunately, a lot of families didn't have a choice on whether their loved one was cremated or not. And a lot of families that wouldn't have normally chosen cremation were forced to choose it, and then afterwards seen it as a viable option going forward for their families.
Mm-hmm. Why would the pandemic make people choose cremation or make that the only available option?
Well, there were certain situations in where the family members were not allowed to be with their loved ones in the hospital, and then they weren't allowed to see them after they passed. They would go directly from the hospital straight to the funeral home or to the crematory in a lot of cases for fear of transmission when it first began.
Yeah, right. That was hard on a lot of people.
It was.
Yeah. And so with Gracie, you talked about with natural burial and green burial, the family is the opposite way. They get to actually sort of be there with the body and be more involved. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Oh, absolutely. So this, it's really interesting because when Bellefontaine started providing green burials to people, we really obviously expected folks to be drawn in by the fact that it's more environmentally friendly. But we didn't necessarily predict just how much power it would give the family in the process. I think a lot of people, when someone dies, I think we've all been there before, where you're just sitting around. There's a lot of sitting. There's a lot of casserole eating. There's very little opportunity for people to feel in control and to manage their feelings. And with something like a green burial, folks are able to actually, in our case, pull the body on a cart from, our chapel to the grave space. They're able to lower their loved one if they wish to in the grave. They're able to blanket them in greens and flowers after the lowering takes place. They can even fill in the grave a little bit. So it really gives people something not only physical to do to get rid of some of that energy, but it empowers them. And I think that that's really, really appealing to people.
Right. I remember when my mom died, I was like, just give me something to do. Because between the death and the burial, I guess, or she was cremated, but it was like a lot of sitting around, like you said. And I remember cleaning my bathroom and just being like, I need something to do with my hands. And so I think the planning that goes into things can actually be really therapeutic for families that are dealing with a death of someone that they love a lot. Right, Tim?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. The first thing I'm immediately thinking, though, about green burials are if you just sort of wrap a body in a sheet and put it in the ground is, and I'm sure you get this question all the time, is that allowed? Like, what are the rules around what needs to be done to people before they're, for example, taken to a cemetery?
So the rules can be a little bit complex, and the laws can be a little bit complex. But suffice it to say that families are allowed to provide their own burial containers. One of the things that we encourage folks to keep in mind is that you have to consider logistics, and your funeral director will help convey the situation that might arise, situations that might arise at the cemetery. You need to be able to lower your loved one. You want to be sure that you are encasing them in a way that's going to be respectful and that manages all of the possibilities that can arise with death. But yeah, we have had plenty of people who have constructed their own pine caskets, for example. There are lots of things that folks can do. If they're interested in doing so and creating something on their own, we highly encourage them to consider doing so in advance. It might not be the time to learn to be a woodworker immediately upon someone's death.
Right. You got to learn it really fast.
Indeed.
And so you mentioned that you do these kinds of burials at Bellefontaine. Where are people who choose this method ultimately buried? Like, if I had my own private property, could I bury my loved one there?
So my pat answer on that is to always check with the zoning commission in the area in which you live. As an individual who works at a cemetery, I can definitely give you the lowdown on where you could be buried within our cemetery, and also things to look for that other cemeteries should have in order for you to know that they're going to be able to facilitate a green burial. Mm-hmm. But if you're interested in burying on your own private property, I would challenge you to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, is this property going to be in your family's possession for longer than the next 20 years?
Right.
You want to keep that kind of information well at hand. So.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about funeral costs. They can add up, as any family who's dealt with this can say. We learned during a previous conversation on St. Louis on the Air how it's usually families with little disposable income that spend the most extravagant amounts on homegoing celebrations. Why do you think that is, and how can a family's culture play into that? Timothy, let's go to you.
Unfortunately, it's something that I have become accustomed to seeing. I think that I would like to say that we have seen a trend of GoFundMe as becoming kind of like the default insurance policy, which I love that the community rallies around those in need, but that should not be our go-to. Pre-planning, it relieves stress. It is imperative for you to do. I cannot talk about how the families I've served that family members had insurance or pre-planned, how beneficial it was to their grieving process and ultimately reaching closure.
Mm-hmm. And I know some people don't want to even discuss that, even if somebody is very clearly nearing death. A lot of times I'll hear, I don't want to invite those thoughts.
Superstitious or cultural reason.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Unfortunately, some people, I have some family members that believe in speaking about it, superstitiously will hasten it or bring it on. Mm-hmm. I believe some of those things are just childhood beliefs or family belief systems or just superstition, like I said, unfortunately. But, the more you're informed and the more you see firsthand how it benefits your family. I have a friend who's a financial advisor, and I wasn't as prepared as I should be. Mm-hmm. And I definitely brought to my attention how the areas that I could definitely benefit my family by pre-planning.
Mm-hmm. A few weeks ago, we had a conversation about the death positive movement, and that movement is all about making the conversation about death less scary, less taboo, making it more of a habit to talk about. These conversations are your careers. How would you recommend someone eases into talking about that with some of their loved ones? Gracie, let's go to you.
Oh, talking about death with
just
your loved
saying,
ones.
Hey, we need to make a plan, and they're like, no.
Hey, listen, it's never an easy conversation to have. I always let parents of children, and oftentimes it's parents of adult children, and they say, I tried to talk to my kids about this, and they put their fingers in their ears, and they didn't want to hear anything about it. And my response is usually, listen, you've got to let them know. You have to let them know where the information is in your home. You have to put it in an accessible location. You have to put it in your wallet so that people can know. And also, just let your kids know what you want, what your wishes are. They might not necessarily be very responsive in the conversation, but they will appreciate it when the time comes, because they will look back and realize that they know how to honor you, and that brings a lot of comfort.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to alternative burial methods. We've been talking about costs. Would a so-called green burial be less expensive than, for example, a traditional burial with a coffin and a vault?
Absolutely. Typically, it is less expensive. You're not paying for a vault. Again, you're not paying for an extravagant casket. You are typically not doing that evening viewing or visitation. It's pared down, but it's no less beautiful. I would say that's the component that's really challenging to convey to people, that they're not getting less of a positive experience, but there are fewer line items to pay for. So it can definitely be something that's very appealing to those who are interested in full burial. I do often say to folks, though, hey, listen, if cost is your number one factor, cremation, as Tim will tell you, gives you the most flexibility with time as well. So it's a very personal choice.
Right. And Tim, I was going to ask you about that. When you said that cremation is becoming more and more popular, do you think cost is a part of that? And I'll start by asking, how does the cost of cremation compare with buying a coffin or a casket? Because I know those can be just astronomically expensive sometimes.
It's extremely cost effective for a family to choose cremation over traditional funeral burial. But on the flip side, aquamation, which is the green option to cremation, can be a little bit more than a traditional cremation. But that appeals to those people that have, the environment in mind and are worried about carbon footprints and greenhouse gases and such. But you definitely save money by going the cremation route with the memorial service.
I'm going to ask a little bit more about this aquamation. And so do you see people coming into your business and asking for that option and asking if you know how to make it happen? Not
as much, but I do believe that in the near future that will begin to uptrend. Aquamation has really been available to funeral service providers for about a decade or so. So it's really fairly new. And like we said, information and being informed will give you your options that you're aware of. A lot of people are just not aware that it's an option and it's something they could do. I personally, I'm going to be directly cremated. My wife knows my wishes and my children as well. But the more I learned about aquamation, I'm leaning towards that. So that's probably what I'm going to be doing for myself.
What's the attraction for you when you think about that? When you it sounded like you had a plan and you're kind of reconsidering. What's making you reconsider?
When I just learned about how regular cremation affects the environment and pollution and greenhouse gases. And then also, you do get more of yourself. That's a good nice way of saying it. Return to you or your family once you do the aquamation route as opposed to cremation with the flame.
Very interesting. Gracie, I'll let you get the last word here. Any final thoughts for people who might be considering this kind of burial?
Folks, there's so much information out there. I highly recommend that people do their research online. It can be an incredibly powerful tool, the internet. Also, the Green Burial Council website, and just type that into Google and you'll find it, really offers a lot of information and resources to people who are just looking to really gather. It also lists all of the certified green burial cemeteries all across the United States. So definitely a great place to visit.
Great. Well, Gracie Griffin and Timothy Johnson, thank you so much for joining us here today.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our production intern is Avery Rogers.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.